Make sure you subscribe to the Below the Surface podcast by Eclipsium in partnership with CRA. Myself and Scott Shefferman host this show, and we've had the pleasure of speaking with some amazing guests, including Zeno Kova, Richard Hughes, Vincent Zimmer, and more. We discuss topics related to firmware and supply chain security, uncovering those pesky vulnerabilities that lie, well, below the surface in your environments. You can find all the episodes and subscribe by visiting eclipsium.com/podcast or searching for Below the Surface in your favorite podcast catcher.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Sarah Harvey about crafting presentations and how the B-Sides SF conference helps new presenters with their first presentation. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Akira Brand, and we've got one announcement. Cyber threats are evolving. Is your organization keeping up? The 2023 Cybersecurity Year in Review is here. Uncover the latest challenges and strategic responses in CRA's 2023 Cybersecurity Year in Review, sponsored by RSA Conference. Same weekend as B-Sides SF, so go get your tickets for both. From the impact of generative AI to the risks of ransomware to navigating new SEC rulings, get ahead for 2024 with your free copy at securityweekly.com/year-in-review 2023. And now we get to talk about the news, and we get to talk with both Akira and John this week, so this is fun. And I'm going to kick us off with just some. We usually start about with just like the Vulns specifically, and I've got two different Vulns. One is about excessive expansion. So this was a Jenkins vuln. There's actually researchers found two critical security vulns in Jenkins. One of them stood out because it was in a third-party library called argsforge or args4j, depending on your Java parlances there. It's basically how to parse command line arguments. And if one of those arguments starts with an @ symbol, it expands the string behind that @ symbol into a file name. And then it loads command lines that might be line by line in that file. But for example, if you do something like @Etsy password, suddenly you get a whole lot of errors and potentially ways to leak the contents of something like Etsy password. So not a great thing. What was interesting to me is that the developers so Jenkins fixed this by basically disabling that expand @ symbol functionality, which makes me wonder, who's responsible here? Talking about surprise, we just talked with Sarah Harvey, and she thought that AppSec might be most likely to surprise us. Here's kind of a surprising feature capability of maybe about a command line parser. So should this have been responsibility of Jenkins to disable this, or did we need this in the first place? And args4j could have just said, we're not going to turn this on. Or if you really, really want this feature, it's off by default, but turn it on yourself. So that's how I wanted to approach this one. And I see John shaking his head. So what are you thinking here on the default approach?
I'm going to start snarky here, but there's a conversation to be had. And the snarky part is I've sort of reached the point where I think of Jenkins as sort of, from a security point of view, is pretty similar to WordPress. In like every month, man, I see like there's a list of Jenkins plugin vulnerabilities which go by, and like I don't even like look at them anymore. So that's not a good situation for a build system in a era where we care about, supply chain. So the question becomes then, it's sort of, okay, Jenkins is like, it's one of those, it's the build cockroach, right? This thing has been around forever in one way or a different form. It's easy enough to use and insecure enough that the developers like, I'm going to use Jenkins. I presume its usage is going down now with GitLab and GitHub and I should remember the name of the other one. There's enough of that going on, right? But I think people have made efforts over the years to try and secure it or do a better job, but at the end of the day, this is where your stuff gets built and should be this most secure part of your system. But I would never. Whereas I know how to. Let me rephrase that. Whereas I've gone through trouble in the past to learn how to secure and harden WordPress and like the trouble that requires. I've never gone to that level of effort for Jenkins, which by itself is a statement. I presume it can be hardened to that level, but it'd be really interesting to see what percentage of people do.
Well, that speaks also to the idea, even last year we're talking about no more hardening guides. Like, why do we need to take that effort? Just why isn't it secure by default for some definition of secure? But I think you're highlighting, there's so much cost there, just that mental cost to harden it. And I think that's a little bit why I wanted to pull out that aspect of not the meta conversation about Jenkins, because I think you're right on that, but more about that situation of supply chain. And this args4j, it had, it was last updated about 3 years ago with just some kind of housekeeping so it could build under Java 8. But the last meaningful update was something like 9 years ago, which doesn't mean that old things are bad. As I go and think about how old I am and how long I've been at AppSec, but it more is a reflection on that idea of how are we maintaining, or how are we monitoring and maintaining cruft, things that are old within our supply chains, and should we move on? For example, args4j has a lot of stuff that maybe Jenkins didn't even need, and here's how it turned into a security vulnerability. And that, I think, is something that translates to other applications as well. It's not just a Jenkins specific thing.
You know what's interesting there? It reminded me a little bit of the whole, what I refer to as the Unix way, where, in other words, your command line tool should do very small things which you can sort of stack together into getting something done.
Nice.
Versus I don't say Windows, but a more monolithic system where, like this particular library, you've got, it can do all sorts of different things. Let's call it the Emacs version. Sorry if I triggered anybody, but is that in a way, like, I guess one of the things, the takeaway from that, if I think about it, like I've talked before about what do I look for in an open source package when I'm going to find something to use. I usually say stars, recent updates, decent number of commits, decent number of committers. Maybe should I add to that? I'm not looking for a framework, but I should prefer be looking for something which gets that one thing done.
One thing done and done well. And I think that's, OpenSSF has been looking at, their top 500 projects and, the criticality, how much they're used. I don't know that that idea, that dimension of one thing well is part of their criteria, but I'd be curious how that, that top 500 list might change when it's, the kitchen sink software, or I think there's an old Jamie Zawinski quote that goes along the lines of every application expands until it handles email, something like that, And I'm going to take that to segue into talking about supply chain as well, and the aging projects. Maven Gate. This is some research from some researchers over at Oversecured, and it does have apologies there. It does have a bit of a couple paragraphs of marketing. Skip the first 2 or 3 paragraphs to get into some of the more interesting parts, where they were pointing out that there's an important distinction between the age of code in a repo and domain names that belong to that repo, or that ostensibly at one point represented an identity or a source of verification, of the package verification for that repo. Because trying to be short about this, it's the cost of maintaining a code base is pretty much zero in this modern day and age, but an annual registration for that domain name costs money. And even if it's $10, $20 a year, not every open source developer wants to bother paying for that. And so what happens then is, if your domain is predicated on serving something like a package manifest, a signature, and somebody re-registers that domain on your project's behalf, they essentially can own it. They can impersonate, and they can do nefarious things. They can put some malware out there. So this was some interesting, to me at least, I'm trying to stop use that word. Here was an article about Maven and what the researchers were pointing out about different exploit scenarios. 2 other things I'll mention real quick is that hopefully SBOMs, this is an area where SBOMs actually become more ubiquitous, and we're just used to actually verifying packages, because the researchers are pointing out that nobody was even verifying packages. That doesn't mean that a package, if you verify it, is secure. It just means you've checked the provenance, at least. It has been tampered with. So I want to be clear on our threat models. And the other thing that I did appreciate is that, to quote, the current system with PGP signing is probably outdated. I think that probably outdated is them being kind. And this is one of the reasons that SigStore is moving to its model of very easy integration with like Git processes and not using PGP. So that was my long-winded version of thinking about this article. Akira, I don't know if there's something here, as you look at, coming in new to AppSec, thinking about, well, let's start off secure. Let's start off with some good practices, how this kind of makes you think about old projects and old repos.
Yeah, so that's interesting, Mike.
No.
The word of the day is for interesting. My main question, and this kind of goes back to what we were just talking about too, is when we are vetting these projects, like should we be using them? Going back to that question of whose responsibility is it to know if this is a project that we should use? Is it ours as security practitioners? Is it the developers to make sure that they're maintaining it, especially with things like these domain names? And honestly, what I kind of desire or long for as someone that's sort of new to this is a way to easily vet these projects to know, like, okay, where are the potential problem spots here? How would I know if this is okay to use? And like, do I need to actually talk to the developers? Like, as John was saying earlier too, like, do we choose projects based on like how frequently they've been updated, on how many stars they have? So all of this is to say, just these past two articles has me thinking, like, gosh, like, when I'm working and we want to use a new software package, oftentimes my developers will get really excited because it does that one thing well that they want to do. But the security posture of the project is not so great. But as a newbie, I feel sometimes really lost of like, well, if we don't want to use this project, then what project do we use? And how do I know when something like passes the sniff test, right? And I'm still sort of refining my own sensibilities around that. So this is a whole nother thing that I'd never even thought about. Like, oh my gosh, like your domains can be utilized by someone that isn't actually the developer. Like, it's just, if I'm being honest, it does seem like kind of overwhelming. So I'm curious, like, how you two approach this.
So, go ahead, John.
No, please.
Well, I was going to mention, so the OpenSSF, they do have the OpenSSF scorecard, does have some factors around how is it maintained, et cetera. But this, even using the scorecard is yet another point of information, but it gets to what do you do? And if we talk about, as a callback to our conversation with Sarah about solutions, what do you, like, if this solves your problem, if this third-party library solves your problem, but it's unowned or it's abandoned, do you move on? Would you actually take on the responsibility of maintaining a third, some open source project? That is a lot of overhead, but you're probably not the most, the best position to do that. So maybe this is something where we need to lobby the OpenSSF as an example. Just OWASP could perhaps do this too, but we need the open source home for orphaned projects and abandoned and some Dickensian way of handling these projects so that there is some organization that can actually keep them useful. So that will be my trying to keep a short response to that.
You know what? Actually, you don't even have to keep them useful. I mean, if there was an organization, it doesn't even have to be an org, if there was a group out there that when a project was abandoned, they would take over ownership and kill it, that'd be perfectly fine, right? Because you're doing something in a definitive way that, like, it's not going to get someone else in trouble. And maybe that's our new side project, Mike and Kara. We go out and just start acquiring these things and just shut them down.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick on you, Akira, but I'm not picking on you. Are you familiar with Maven?
Maven? Yeah, a little bit.
Okay. Okay, I won't go further. Where I was going to go with that, just for folks listening, right, is relatively new AppSec person. Do they know all these tools, that stack, right? And I think we're going to I'll probably talk about stack when the other article is coming, but you're having to deal with the language, you're having to deal with the build system. Now you're going to have to deal with this Maven thing on top of it. Is that part of the build system or is that part of your development environment, or where does that thing fit in? But really it's getting more and more complex is the point there. and that becomes it becomes more and more that you have to learn, beside having, like you said, like a checklist or something like that, or a scoring site. It's a more and more complex problem to try and wrap your head around, especially as a new person in the industry. And so,
Yeah,
kudos,
for sure.
keep it up on it.
Keep going. One thing I'll
Yeah.
say too is like something I'm starting to do personally is to look at some open source projects to start contributing to, right? As an AppSec engineer, and just bringing on my expertise there. And I don't know if this is really anywhere here nor there, but we don't have enough security people in the open source ecosystem to help make sure that these projects are okay. Like, I mean, I've met a couple people that are security people that do open source development and maintenance, but man, there's not a lot of us.
Yeah, and I love that example because it's so easy just to go and find and say, "Oh, you've got some problems. You've got some problems. Look at this list of problems." And then it tends to be crickets when it's sort of like, "We need some help doing the maintenance, fixing them, etc." And so it's a great thing that you're highlighting that, Akira, and getting your hands on the keyboard to start doing some coding. We'll come back to we did a 6 months later. We're going to come back to you 6 months later and see what you've been contributing to. And we'll do a side by side code review live on air. No.
Oh yeah,
we'll
for
find
sure.
out what's
Tear
been
me
fun.
apart.
Speaking of no, constructive here. Well, mostly constructive as I set up a segue. Speaking of killing things, John, how do you feel about PyPy?
Oh boy.
Long sigh.
Oh Lord.
Yeah. So I posted another, and I think it's sometimes we try to go one or two ways here with ASW. Frequently, if we're overdoing something or giving something too much attention, we'll try to just pick on something else for a change. I can't find the tab, but I know what it is. Another in the last week, and I'm probably just seeing one of many, but there is yet another vulnerable Pippy package. I believe it's for Fortinet security folks found this one. And, it's like sort of similar vein we're seeing recently on these, where malicious users will find an existing package, manage to get their code up into it, and then, profit when everyone downloads that and does whatever it is they're looking to do. You're basically finding an easy way to, I wouldn't call it a rootkit, but you're finding an easy way to compromise other systems. They actually have an interesting graph on this one of sort of the timeline of how it went. But end of day, the reason I'm mentioning this is not so much anything particular in this one, although it is a good write-up, but it's yet another one. And I think, Mike, it was about a year ago when I said, hey, hoping to see an improvement in these library software repos. And we're another year forward, and I think we covered a few things here and there where some of these repos are trying to do a little more security, but it really feels like it's not a lot. And this sort of comes back to what, that theme we're on with Akira of like, okay, well, now we've talked about the Javas and the Mavens and those type of things and the Jenkins. And now, by the way, one of your developers for some reason has a thing for Python, so go start using that too. And he has like some pip commands in his builds to start downloading some of these things. Or maybe he's done it right and he's got requirements.txt. But either way, now you've got more software that's coming into your build from other places that your guys didn't write. And maybe he didn't actually pin the version number on there. He just said, hey, I need, whatever this library is. And the next thing, what was a perfectly fine build, you're suddenly using fdebug or whatever these things are. And, you've suddenly got a software which you're giving out either on your website to run or giving to your customers that has some sort of vulnerability in there. And that's not great. And I guess where the reason I'm sort of going down is beside the fact that it's a more and more complex problem that I'm waiting for that surprise for 2024. We've seen one or two vendors that are starting to, or that have solutions out to try and, make this problem go away. I'd really love to see that we don't have to depend on those third-party vendors. But I guess we have what we have for now. Huh?
Oh, we have what we have for now. What a motto for AppSec. Now, we've been talking about vulnerabilities in code and a lot of like memory safety, things like this, coding mistakes. There are different types of vulnerabilities out there as well, in the sense of even just ambiguity. And here is something in Google Cloud Permissions that I'm by no means an expert, whether it's GKE or whether it's on the AWS side, but I might look at something and see allow authenticated and think, well, that seems fine. Nothing can go wrong with allowing authenticated users to access my resources, right? Maybe, John, help me out. Maybe.
I mean,
okay. Oh, phew.
You have to be authenticated so you can use your GKE cluster, right? So I mean, you got that. There's nothing wrong with that theory at all. Except we're talking about it here, so except. In this particular world, so one thing which Google Cloud does differently than the other major cloud providers is they enable IAM by default in their GKE, in their Kubernetes clusters, Kubernetes services, which they provide to customers, GKE. And the problem with this here, last summer, I think it was, we had a few articles talking about the complexity of these, what these IAM models look like for the various different providers. Like, you've got all these different services with all these different roles and abilities for levels of activity for each one. So getting these things dialed in right is, I'm adding more to your workload, Akira, sorry. But in this particular case, it looks like they were being a little bit overzealous underzealous in how they actually allowed folks to access these by default. And they started off with what was called let's see if I still have it around. I have your Wiz tab. Where's my Wiz tab? I'm getting all my tabs screwed up today. But anyways, I believe it was sysall was the default credential which they were giving in there. There it is. Yeah, sysall. So sysall, as you can sort of imagine, would allow someone who comes in with a GCP IAM credential to have any access on that GKE cluster. That doesn't sound too bad, except the problem with that was I really meant what they said. Any GCP customer user with an IAM cred could come in and take a look-see at your GKE cluster. So they've removed that particular role mapping, but there's still others in there by default. And so, the problem here is, I want to go through and talk about these stacks for a second because they're massively complex and I'm learning more each day, unfortunately. Fortunately. But so no one heard that. So you think about, you're an IaaS provider, so you've done everything you need to do to build your infrastructure cloud. So your servers, your storage, your network, all those three parts at a large modern provider are working at a completely different scale than what we're used to seeing, right? So that means the standard way we secure these things or run these things or all the things we have to do is massively different. Okay, well now we need an identity platform, so we need to have that in there. There's tons of videos on this type of stuff up on the YouTube, but how do you scale an identity platform large enough so that when you have millions of users, you're able to get your responses back to them in a flick of a second? Okay, that's cool. Now on top of that, I want to do GKE cluster. So I need to be able to spin up a Kubernetes cluster for a user on demand on top of everything I just mentioned, along with the security for it. And then you need to go through and think about how you secure Kubernetes on top of that. So it's getting more and more complex here, unfortunately. But the point being, one of the articles I saw beside this one, which I've linked in, actually mentioned, and I don't know how accurate this is, apparently it is, that users with a Gmail account could actually get access to some people's Kubernetes clusters. I'd have to think that through. That's at least getting my head tilting sideways. But the point here, long and short, end of the day, is back to Mike's favorite thing. Secure by default, this was not. It's one thing to have to harden your Kubernetes cluster. It's another thing to have to just harden the identity before you even do anything with it. Should this thing be exposed to the internet? No. Orca here, the guys that found this stuff, were actually going and, I'm presuming with cloud providers' blessing, poking around and finding these clusters and finding like keys to other cloud providers, all sorts of bad things which you don't want. But yeah, it's the long and short is something else to keep track of, unfortunately. I'm trying to make this a happy morning for people, but yeah.
Exactly. That's the type of surprise that we don't want to bring to people. And it also just highlights that aspect of how do you, maybe it's documenting, presenting, making choices for users about what does it mean for this sysall or for authenticated users? What are the implications really of this particular setting? And I wanted to use this to talk a little bit, segue from our Vulns specifically into talking about Vulns and maybe a little bit more secure design. So I have a group of articles that we'll try to talk about real quick. One about MiraclePtr, which is the C++ world inside Google Chrome, as well as a Cisco Vuln that's not too interesting, that's more about just handling network messages. And also you had an article, John, about was Rust worth it? So we're talking about some refactoring things. Now, real quick, the MiraclePtr, over a year, Google has seen over 50%, 57% reduction in mitigating use after free exploits. And this is on the back of maybe, from what I can gather, 3 to 4 years of developing the MiraclePtr and what it was based on. So, but that's kind of impressive to refactor inside of C++, this particular pointer type, to get a really positive impact. So, and one of my comments, one of my favorite things is always like, well, let's rewrite something, or let's refactor. Let's just use Rust from the beginning. And I don't know, Akira, how often these types of conversations specifically come up, but you're basically talking to your developers and saying, do more work. That's got to be a tough thing. So it's sort of like, do some more work or do different work, but here's why. Here's how it would help you. And I don't know if you've had what those types of conversations might have sounded like with you and your teams.
Yeah, actually, I was just talking with a colleague of mine. His name is Dustin Lair, and he has a business that is all about creating security champions. And we were talking about this exact topic of when you are wanting your developers to do stuff and you say, hey, you should do this thing, and that's where you leave it, like it doesn't get done because, well, why should I do that thing? So his business is all about helping people like me motivate the developer to actually do the thing, as it were. One thing I find is I can appeal to two things that really do motivate people. One is achievement and advancement. So for example, like having conversations with engineering managers and saying, hey, like if your developers start displaying an aptitude for security, taking on more security-minded tasks, like would you please be willing to like include that in their performance reviews? And even maybe consider that as a function of promotion, right? So, and EMs are usually pretty open to that, which I found, which is great. The second thing, in the world of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We have, of course, on the bottom, we have food and shelter, and then the middle is, art and whatever. And then the top is like self-actualization. Software developers usually have the first couple layers pretty well down, just by virtue of having a job and getting paid. And if you can appeal to that higher level of like, hey, you're actually going to grow, you're going to learn, you're going to become a better developer, you're going to become a better practitioner, you're going to become like wiser in your approach, I find that actually really works. So yeah, if I can appeal either to the sense, ironically, to the sense of the lowest level of like, let's get you more money, let's get you more acolytes, let's get you more recognition. And then to that, like the top side of that pyramid of let's increase your knowledge, let's increase your wisdom, let's increase your ability to enrich yourself, that those approaches both work.
And increasing your wisdom. It totally does. And it's also,
okay, cool.
As a D&D player, don't make wisdom your dump stat, even for your fighters, because that whole person's going to be nasty. But John, kind of on the same vein, you've got that article, as we talk about, I love to say refactoring, and we talk about rewriting Rust. That was obviously a theme throughout 2023. It's already been a theme for 2024. But was Rust worth it? So this is one of those aspects of how much, we do want to appeal to engineers and their needs. Are we right all the time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you. We can finish.
Got it.
As much as we'd love to say that. No, so this was an interesting piece by gentleman who has both been the co-creator of a framework, Rust-based framework, as well as I believe he has around 100 packages up on crates.io. So he's written a good amount of Rust in production type environments. And what I wanted to think, the reason it was interesting to me is exactly that, Mike. We can sit here and talk about Rust saves all the world, blah, 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 blah. What's it like to use this beast? Like, yes, I've written some Rust, probably on thousands of lines, not much bigger than that. But if you're doing this day in, day out, it'd be interesting from my point of view to just, leave the article alone for a second. It would be interesting to me to take a pause in 3 or 4 years and look back and go, how did it go? And that's what he's done. So there's good and bad parts in this article. And I think he's done a fairly even sort of keel of talking about the good and the bad. You can maintain more with less and go. Excuse me, go. You had Go story in there. More with less in Rust. The most highlighted part of this article, which I do get a kick off of, is programming in Rust is like being in an emotionally abusive relationship. Rust screams at you all day, every day, often about things you would have considered perfectly normal in another life. And that's the linter it's in there. It's very picky about what's going on. But the reason he makes this comment is when he goes back to other software languages, he feels that he is now a better software developer because he's been sort of beaten into submission by Rust. And that's sort of the result. So that's good and bad. On the pure more bad, on his bad list side, let me put it that way, bad leader for myself. There's some gaps he doesn't like about that linter is how you configure it is a little iffy. The one I thought was really interesting is when you think about how do you structure a software project in Rust. In many languages, you'll have here's my private libraries, which are just for me to use internally. This is the things I want to publish. And how that's done in Rust is you can do that. But then at that point, if those private libraries are in something you want to publish, your whole sort of thing breaks apart and you have to think about doing it a different way. So it really requires significant rethinking of moving your brain into a new way of thinking about how you package things. At the same time, he talks about Rust workspaces, cargo workspaces, which do help with that to a degree. And then the final talk is, as you mentioned, refactoring. And the point he brings up here is due to it being such a strongly typed language and how type really sort of is a core component of that. If you go to start moving things around and refactoring, that typing might actually come back and bite you because it actually slows things down more than what you wanted to actually get done with the refactoring. So good and bad. But I want to put in here is sort of it's we talk a lot of positives about Rust, and it's not the silver bullet for every single thing out there. So for folks who are thinking about it, this gives you something to think about on the other side.
Indeed, it does. And I like the subheading too is just from JavaScript to Rust. And one of my thoughts too is that, one of the on the badness side was I think the type system, or just getting used to that type system. And I can appreciate that, especially coming from the Wild West of JavaScript. Now, one of my curiosities would be to follow up, was this developer familiar with TypeScript? Had they gone through the JavaScript TypeScript type of journey into Rust, or is this something that would also be common just once you start to get into stronger typed systems? And that's a hurdle that just saying rewrite in Rust can be one of those empty platitudes that we do honestly try to avoid. We're running low on time, so speaking of things that aren't platitudes, educating developers about security. I mean, that's one of the things underlying that we want to do. And I sort of predicated, John, your article about, teasing about what security can say to developers. And this article from CISA is we must consider software developers a key part of the cybersecurity workforce. My immediate feeling actually is just to invert the sense of that. I think everything in the article I agree with, but the framing is possibly more of why not just consider security part of the developer workforce? But rather than dive into the pedantic quibbling about a title, I think the meat of the argument is that academia is not educating in the university system enough developers with security-minded aspects. So I want to introduce that, and maybe as we start to wind down here, throw over to Akira, then you, John, about what did you think about when you reading through just this very brief article?
Yeah. So what jumped out to me, and we talked about this briefly, Mike, was the third point of there isn't like that industry need or industry demand for like secure developers, which is interesting because I think that is really a failing on the part of the cybersecurity industry, not a failing on the part of like the development community. I think once the developers get into the jobs, that's when the cybersecurity people come in and they're like, why don't you know how to do this? But we've never like actually gone and created like jobs called secure software developer, right? I mean, AppSec is like the closest thing that I can think of, but there's not like an actual job title called software developer security minded or something like that, right? So until we actually create real paying JD jobs, right? Like there's actually a job description for this thing, and it includes must have 2 to 3 years of security training in software development. I don't think the needle's going to move. Like people need to get paid.
That's interesting because that speaks to my initial reaction about the framing. And I'm not sure the framing I would say is that a software developer with security training is a special job role. I'm coming at it from developers should just have had some training as a natural part of their specialization in creating a protocol, creating a front-end framework, back-end database, handling things like that. But we're running low on time, so let's have John give a chance to get the last word in for this time.
Go for it, John. Play us off.
I'm going to try and do it quickly. I don't agree with you, Kara.
That's fine.
I think, let me see if I can try and speak it out quickly and concisely. You're never going to find a software developer who has 2 to 3 years of security training because no software developer in the right mind is going to sit through 2 to 3 years of security.
Right.
I think this. I'm aligned a little bit with Mike on this. I think I got the feeling he was given a headline. The author was given a headline to write to, and then they wrote some stuff. Because if you rephrase that and said, made the headline of it be, we need educational institutions to train developers that are coming out with those security experiences, that would be a lot more relevant. I can do security but not speak, apparently. Apologies. The second part you said there around a special separate title of secure software developer. I'm pretty sure I've put security into my software developer job descriptions before. But you're not going to get there should not be a difference between a secure software developer and a software developer.
Yeah, for sure. Because
then where do I put the generic guy? And then people are going to say, oh, he doesn't have security, we can pay him less, or we're going to put him on like, right? That's what's going to happen. I think it comes back a little bit to sort of look at it from a different point of view. Mike's standard hardened by default. So if we harden those software developers by default when they're coming out of school, but at the same time, I don't know. As I go through different organizations and different roles from my life, I'm not seeing as big of a problem with software developers and either their interest. I'm trying to keep this tight. Either their interest in security, their interest in writing secure code. I feel like the majority of developers I've met over the last few years that they get that. I think it's almost more of a management problem of we're not giving them enough time to write that secure code. We have to get something out the door, so we're always cutting corners. So yeah, and then if that's the case, then now you're going to have unhappy developers. Your job satisfaction is going down, so that they're being taught this stuff in school. It feels like a waste of their time because they're never using it in the real world. So do we need to have HBR teaching classes on secure software development? And I think I've seen it posted in their magazines. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. As I think that through, I don't think it's a software developer problem at all. I think it's a management problem. That's going to be my hot take.
like it'll take some culture shifts. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was going to wrap that up by saying that John, Akira, and listeners, if you have thoughts on this, you can also write them up as a request for information. So that part of the reason for this article is this is this is an RFI, looking for feedback on the role of security in computer science education. And so you've got until February 20th to go send in your responses. So start typing and let people know about that, about where you see those problems. But I see really no problems. Oh, go ahead.
When you submit your responses over there, do make sure you mention Application Security Weekly.
Please do. You can ASW or spell it out. We'll take both. But thank you for always be selling, John. This is good. Thank you once again, John. Glad you were here. Same as always, Akira. Glad you were able to join us. Thanks everyone else. Please do subscribe, share on the socials, check out our show notes. And speaking of presentations, check out She's on Video from Let 'em Riot. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.